Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story about ancient Egypt's most famous king, who ruled the world's most powerful empire before he could grow a moustache, and was dead before he could legally rent a camel. King Tutankhamun. He's the golden boy of archaeology, the poster child for ancient royalty, the reason half of us know how to spell Tutankhamun without looking. But behind the gold mask and glittering tomb is a story that's much stranger and sadder than anything they teach you in school. His life was short, his bones were brittle, and his family tree was more of a loop, and yet the name Tut lives on, glowing like a lantern in the dark halls of history. So dim the lights, pull up your linen sheets, maybe light a little incense, or just open that window and let the night air roll in like the Nile breeze. Because we're travelling back to a time of sacred cats, sun gods, royal incest, political cover-ups, and some of the worst parenting decisions in human history. Let's begin. Tutankhamun wasn't supposed to be king. He was the leftover prince, the unexpected spare to the divine Egyptian throne. He was likely born around 1341 BCE, in the waning years of a radically weird period in Egyptian history, one ruled by his probable father, Pharaoh Akhenaten. Now, Akhenaten wasn't your average pharaoh. He was the guy who tried to cancel Egypt's entire religious system and replace it with a single sun god named Aten. Out with Amun, gone with Osiris. He wanted monotheism before it was cool. He even moved the capital to a brand new city in the middle of the desert. Artists started painting people with weird, alien-like features, and pharaohs were suddenly shown with bellies and chins. It was an aesthetic revolution, and also kind of a political disaster. So when Akhenaten died, or disappeared, depending on which historian you ask, the throne was suddenly up for grabs. Egypt needed a reset, and somewhere in the royal nursery a boy was handed the crook and flail. Tutankhamun. Yes, that was his original name, literally meaning living image of Aten, a leftover badge from his father's failed religious experiment. He was probably around 8 or 9 years old at the time. That's right. He was ruling an empire before he'd even mastered cursive hieroglyphs. If you're picturing a child sitting on a throne surrounded by adults whispering in his ears, you're not wrong. Tut had no power of his own, at least not at first. The real authority was held by a few crafty adults, his vizier A, his general Horemheb, and the priestly class waiting for their shot at a comeback. Now, one of the very first things those puppet masters did, they changed the boy's name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. Living image of Amun. The sun god was out. The old gods were back, and Egypt was ready to pretend the last 2 decades were just a bad fever dream. So what was life like for Tut during all this? Well, strange probably. You're a child living in a palace, being dressed in golden linen, learning how to pray to gods your father once banned. You're being married off to your half-sister, a girl named Ankhesenamun, because when your family is trying to preserve divine bloodlines, the dating pool gets very, very shallow. And then there's the health side of things. Tut wasn't well, like really not well. His mummy would later reveal a laundry list of issues: clubfoot, cleft palate, scoliosis, malaria, and probably a bone disease that made walking painful. His chariots, yes, plural, found in his tomb were probably ceremonial. Because let's be honest, Tut wasn't doing donuts in the royal courtyard with brittle legs and one good foot. This was a pharaoh who ruled from couches, not chariots. And yet Tut tried. He restored temples, he rehired priests, he tried to heal the damage his father had caused by basically bringing Egypt's entire religion back from the dead. His reign only lasted about 9 years, but he managed to set things back on track. At least enough for the next guy to claim everything was stable again. Then, at the ripe old age of 18 or 19, Tutankhamun suddenly died. No war, no glory, no big public spectacle, just gone. To this day, we don't really know what killed him. Malaria, genetic disease, a broken leg that got infected, murder. Some wild theories say he was taken out by political rivals, maybe even those same advisors who guided him through childhood and now wanted the throne for themselves. Others blame inbreeding, illness, or an unlucky mosquito bite. Whatever it was, it left Egypt without an heir, and it left the people in charge with a royal corpse and a bit of a PR crisis. Tutankhamun was hastily buried in a small tomb, one not originally meant for a king. His body was poorly mummified, so poorly in fact that parts of him were charred from chemical reactions inside the sarcophagus. His tomb was sealed quickly, and then Egypt moved on. His name was erased from monuments, his legacy buried in sand, and that would have been the end of it. But in 1922, over 3,000 years later, British archaeologist Howard Carter stuck a shovel into the Valley of the Kings and struck gold, literally. Tutankhamun's tomb was still mostly intact, a treasure trove of unimaginable wealth and beauty, with golden shrines, alabaster jars, and that now iconic gold death mask staring out with eternal youth. Suddenly, the forgotten boy king was everywhere. The world went Tut mad. Newspapers, museums, curses, pop songs, Halloween costumes. He was a global phenomenon. But who was the real Tutankhamun? Not just the mask, not just the mummy, but the boy, the king, the son of a revolution, the puppet of schemers, the broken body ruler trying to hold together a crumbling empire. Tonight, we're going to find out. We'll explore what it was really like to be Tutankhamun, starting with what it meant to be a pharaoh at age 9, before puberty, before power, before even knowing which gods you were allowed to worship. We'll peel back the linen and gold layer by layer and uncover the strange, tragic and very human story behind history's most iconic corpse. So get cozy, because our journey through King Tut's real life starts now. Being crowned pharaoh is supposed to be a moment of triumph. Trumpets, lotus petals, gold-drenched processions, real, divine ruler of the Nile energy. But for Tutankhamun, that coronation moment felt more like being handed the world's most cursed homework assignment. He was 9. 9. Most kids that age are learning how to tie sandals, not rule the largest, richest empire on earth. But there he was, Tutankhamun, as he was still called then, stuffed into ceremonial linen, plopped onto a throne, and officially declared the living god of Upper and Lower Egypt. And if that sounds absurd, don't worry. Even the adults knew this was going to be weird. The ceremony was all about optics. Tut didn't choose his regalia. He didn't write his own speech. He probably didn't even understand half the blessings being chanted by the high priests. He was a 9-year-old with a fancy title, surrounded by men 2 decades into their scheming careers. Vizier I, the aging political puppet master, General Horemheb, the military hammer-in-waiting, and an entire temple class waiting for someone, anyone, not named Akhenaten to put their gods back on the throne. In the beginning, Tut was more royal mascot than monarch. His day-to-day life was probably less about issuing decrees and more about learning how not to drool on scrolls. He would have had tutors, scribes, priests, astronomers, feeding him the ancient Egyptian version of standardized curriculum, how to read hieroglyphs, how to conduct religious rituals, how to appease gods with good posture. He learned the geography of his empire, the correct number of ducks to offer in a temple, this was serious business, and how to recite the proper hymns without sneezing mid-chant. But that didn't mean he was safe. The court was a pressure cooker. At 9, Tut was already married, or being arranged to marry, his half-sister Ankhesenamun, who was herself probably not much older. Because nothing says romance like keeping the divine bloodline pure through aggressive sibling pairing. Their union wasn't about love, it was about optics and lineage. You can almost imagine some sunburned vizier with a scroll in one hand and a glass of date wine in the other, saying, "If it worked for the gods, it'll work for you." Inside the palace, life was surreal. Tut's rooms were likely covered in vibrant murals of gods and myths. Servants hovered nearby to fan him, dress him, bring him roasted goose or date cakes when he asked. But make no mistake, he was also under constant watch. You don't crown a fragile boy with no experience and just let him wander off to play stickball by the Nile. Everything he did, every word he spoke, every glance or giggle or complaint, someone was taking note. Meanwhile, the empire outside was cracking at the seams. Akhenaten's religious revolution had thrown everything into chaos. The temples of Amun, the biggest god in town, had been shut down. Priests were unemployed, temple economies collapsed, and Egypt's people were left confused and furious. Tut's handlers knew this couldn't last. So one of the first major decisions the young king made, renouncing his father's legacy. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. The court began restoring the old religion. Temples to Amun were rebuilt, statues were re-erected, Thebes, the old capital, regained its power. It was a PR makeover disguised as divine redemption. The gods were back in business, and the boy king was the poster child for national healing. Except again, he was still a boy. He likely struggled to walk, thanks to his clubfoot, and needed a cane, even as royal artists carefully avoided showing him as anything but strong and upright. His portraits didn't show pain, they showed perfection. That was the job of Egyptian art, not to reflect reality, but to project cosmic order. In truth, Tutankhamun was surrounded by pressure, pageantry, and, most critically, other people's agendas. He had a crown on his head, but no hand on the scepter. Every decision was filtered through viziers and generals, priests and scribes. If Tut wanted to change his hairstyle, it probably went through 3 committees and a ritual blessing. Still, there's evidence, tiny fragments of it, that Tut was not just a puppet. He issued a few edicts, he commissioned temples and statues, he showed up to ceremonies, greeted officials, maybe even tried to assert his will from time to time. He was growing into the role slowly, trying perhaps to figure out what it meant to be divine in a body that was breaking down. And he wasn't alone in his challenges. His wife, Ankhesenamun, was also navigating the chaos. The two had at least 2 stillborn daughters, their tiny mummified bodies discovered in Tut's tomb centuries later. These weren't symbolic funerals, these were real tragedies. And for a king whose job it was to continue the divine line, it was a silent crisis. In those early years of rule, while Egypt publicly celebrated the return of balance and ma'at, its young pharaoh and queen were silently grappling with grief, illness and isolation. It's easy to forget, under the glare of the golden mask, that these were teenagers living in a pressure-cooked palace full of sycophants and secret agendas. And then there was I, vizier to Tut, former confidant of Akhenaten, and soon to be something more. I wasn't just pulling strings, he was positioning himself. As the old man of the court, he likely saw the fragility of his young ruler and quietly prepared for the inevitable. A's name appears on several inscriptions alongside the king, too close, some might say, and when Tut eventually died, it would be A who swooped in to take the throne, and even the widow. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, Tut is still growing, still learning, still performing rituals with aching legs and a forced smile. The empire is slowly stabilizing. The gods are back. The people are beginning to trust again. And in the heart of the palace, a boy is trying to become a king before his time runs out. So the question isn't whether Tutankhamun ruled Egypt. It's whether Egypt ever really let him be a child. And that leads us to the next chapter, his family. Because if you think palace life was stressful, just wait until you meet the parents. The royal family wasn't just dysfunctional, it was genetically confusing. Let's just say, when your family tree starts to resemble a papyrus spiral, things get complicated fast. And so next, we'll take a quiet, candlelit walk through the most tangled, controversial and scientifically baffling bloodline in pharaonic history, the one that produced King Tut. It's often said that ancient Egyptian royalty believed they were descended from the gods. Divine blood, sacred lineage, the whole deal. And to protect that holiness, they did something most of us would consider medically inadvisable. They kept it in the family. And when we say family, we mean the immediate family. Like, very immediate. You know how in a normal household, marrying your sibling is considered wildly inappropriate? In ancient Egyptian royalty it was practically mandatory. Which brings us back to Tutankhamun. You already know he married his half-sister. But that's just the surface. Tut's entire family tree is a tangle of close cousins, sibling pairings, and what can only be described as pharaonic matchmaking gone rogue. His story isn't just about ruling Egypt, it's about surviving a gene pool that resembled a kiddie pool, shallow, warm, and dangerously repetitive. Let's unravel this slowly, before the royal family gives you a nosebleed. Tut's father was almost certainly Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who tried to reinvent religion, and his mother? Likely one of Akhenaten's own sisters. Not Nefertiti, the glamorous queen with the famous bust, but a lesser-known royal woman whose name remains lost in time. DNA testing conducted in the early 2000s confirmed it. Tut's parents were siblings, full-blooded, not cousins, not once removed, straight-up brother and sister. Now, to the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't nearly as scandalous as it sounds today. To them, the gods married their siblings, Osiris and Isis, Shu and Tefnut. The pharaoh was the earthly embodiment of divine power, so it made sense to imitate divine relationships. If the gods could keep it in the family, so could the house of Horus. But gods, of course, don't have mitochondria. Human genetics is a bit less forgiving. Tutankhamun inherited a double dose of the same DNA, which means all the weird recessive traits had nowhere to hide. His body paid the price. Elongated skull, cleft palate, clubfoot, weakened immune system, and possibly necrosis in one leg that left him barely able to walk. CT scans of his mummy revealed all of this, along with an oddly feminine hip structure and signs of scoliosis. In modern terms, it reads like a genetic train wreck. Tut wasn't the only royal to suffer from this. His daughters, yes, he had at least two, were born stillborn and both showed severe deformities. Their tiny mummified bodies were found in his tomb, wrapped carefully in gold-leafed coffins, their short lives mourned in silence. It's possible Ankhesenamun carried other pregnancies that also ended in heartbreak. The royal bloodline may have looked impressive on a scroll, but inside the body it was a ticking time bomb. Now let's talk about Nefertiti for a moment. While she wasn't Tut's biological mother, she played a major role in the palace during his early years. As Akhenaten's chief queen, and possibly stepmother to Tut, Nefertiti may have served as a maternal presence. Some even believe she ruled Egypt under a different name after Akhenaten's death, possibly as Pharaoh Neferneferuaten or Smenkare, before Tut was installed. But as is often the case in ancient Egypt, the records were conveniently vague. Political coups don't always leave tidy paperwork. So the boy king grew up in a world where family was power, but power was built on genetic roulette. And things got weirder. Tut's wife, Ankhesenamun, was not just his half-sister. She was also a direct descendant of Nefertiti and Akhenaten. That made their union a double dip into the royal gene pool. After Tut's death, she would find herself in a desperate position. With no heir, no surviving children, and no clear path forward, she took a step no other Egyptian queen had ever dared. She wrote a letter to a foreign enemy, specifically the king of the Hittites, a longtime rival of Egypt. In her letter, she begged him to send one of his sons to marry her, so she wouldn't have to marry a servant. That's how she described her situation. It was a royal cry for help. and a rare glimpse of just how trapped Ankhesenamun was in this dynastic disaster. The Hittite king sent a prince, but he was assassinated before reaching Egypt. Suspicious? Absolutely. Someone didn't want that marriage to happen. Perhaps Aa, perhaps Horemheb, perhaps both. The bloodline was sacred until it wasn't convenient, and so, after Tutankhamun's death, the fragile thread of his family legacy was quietly snipped. His name would be omitted from king lists, his statues buried, his tomb hastily sealed. Ai would marry the widow and wear the crown. Horemheb would later take power and try to erase the entire generation from history. It was a political purge dressed in ritual robes. But Tut's DNA didn't lie. Modern science has been kinder than his courtiers. In 2010, a team of researchers from Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities performed genetic testing on 11 royal mummies. They pieced together the family web. Tut's parents were full siblings. His wife was both his sister and cousin. His daughters died in the womb. And yet, through it all, the fragile strands of that royal genome told a very human story. One of ambition, love, tragedy, and resilience. It's strange, isn't it? For all the gold, all the ceremony, all the divine declarations and stone-carved grandeur, the royal family behind it all was just a group of people trying to uphold a myth, and in doing so, they doomed themselves to bodies that broke under the weight of that ambition. So next time you hear the phrase blood of the gods, maybe remember that even divine blood has its limits, but Tut's story doesn't end with genetics, because even with a body that ached and legs that buckled, the boy king still tried to rule, to walk, to ride, to lead. Which brings us to what that actually looked like. Next, we'll take a walk through the royal palaces, not in slippers, but with canes, ointments, and orthopedic sandals. We'll look at the physical reality of being a pharaoh with a foot that barely touched the ground. Because gods may ride chariots, but King Tut limped. Let's get something out of the way. No matter how much gold they packed around him, no matter how perfect the statues made him look, Tutankhamun was not a healthy kid. The boy god king of Egypt didn't stride through palace halls with the thunderous gait of a warrior pharaoh. He didn't ride into battle at the head of a chariot column, or throw javelins under the blazing Theban sun. He limped, slowly, painfully, constantly. His body was a fragile puzzle assembled from inbred parts and adolescent ambition. You wouldn't know it from his portraits. Those always showed him in standard pharaoh pose, tall, symmetrical, square-jawed, idealized. But when you cut through the myth and down to the bones, you find the truth was far less glamorous. In 2005, Tut's body was CT scanned for the first time. What they found wasn't majestic, it was tragic. Let's start with his feet, or more accurately his club foot. His left foot was twisted inward and malformed, likely from birth. The bones were misaligned, and his toe bones were necrotic, dying tissue, rotting away even in life. He couldn't walk without pain, and some days, likely not at all. Tut used canes, lots of them. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, many of them heavily worn, some snapped at the base from repeated use. They weren't just ceremonial, they were mobility devices. Imagine being the literal king of the world, and you can't walk from your throne to the balcony without leaning on polished acacia wood. Now toss in scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, which twisted his back and likely caused additional discomfort. His hips were deformed, his sternum oddly shaped, and his leg bones didn't match in length. Add malaria. Yes, multiple strains of malaria were detected in his remains, and what you've got isn't just a kid in pain, but a kid under siege from every corner of his own biology. And yet, he tried. The tomb contains chariots, not one, but 6 of them. Some were full-sized, some were smaller and lighter, possibly training models. At first glance, you'd think they belonged to a conquering hero, but experts believe most of them were unused, pristine, decorative. One or two may have seen use in gentle staged events, maybe even dragged slowly around a palace courtyard while priests cheered politely. Because realistically, he couldn't have driven one himself. You need strong legs to anchor yourself in a chariot. You need coordination, endurance, and upper body strength to handle a bow and guide the horses. Tutankhamun didn't have that luxury. He had walking sticks. He had ointments. He had pain. Which raises a bigger question. What does it mean to be a god on earth when your body keeps failing? It meant appearances mattered more than truth. The palace likely maintained an image of Tut as a vibrant young king. Public ceremonies were choreographed to hide his weaknesses. He might have been carried on a sedan chair during major events, then set carefully down for photo-op moments before being whisked away to recover in private. He was the ultimate figurehead, decorated, adored, and extremely breakable. But don't mistake that fragility for passivity. Tut wasn't just lounging on pillows while everyone else ran the country. The restoration stela, a large inscribed slab, documents that Tutankhamun made real efforts to repair the religious chaos his father left behind. He reinstated the priesthoods, he reopened temples, he funded sacred festivals and made offerings to the gods of old. This wasn't just political cleanup, it was a massive cultural restoration, and it happened on his watch. Behind the scenes, though, his health issues meant he needed help, constant help. Personal attendants, likely eunuchs or trusted advisors, were probably never more than a few steps away. Physicians treated his wounds. Herbalists mixed tonics, some for pain, others for fertility. Ancient Egyptian medicine was advanced in some areas, but it didn't have a cure for brittle bones and generational inbreeding. His marriage, already complicated by shared bloodlines, also bore the weight of biology. Ankhesenamun must have known their chances of producing a healthy heir were slim. The miscarriages and stillbirths weren't just personal tragedies, they were political ones. Every failed pregnancy weakened the dynasty's claim to continuity. So the palace spun the narrative, painted him strong, prayed harder, hid the pain. Even Tut's death may be linked to his physical vulnerability. One theory suggests he broke his leg shortly before dying. The fracture, visible in his femur, may have been caused by a fall. Combine that with malaria, and it becomes a fatal mix: infection, fever, system failure. Others point to a more sinister theory: murder, perhaps from someone tired of propping up a sickly king and ready to seize the throne. We'll get to that theory soon enough. But whether it was accident or assassination, Tut's condition made him an easy target. You don't have to push hard to topple a body already on the edge. The deeper tragedy, Tut likely knew. He wasn't stupid. He may have been young and sickly and manipulated, but he also grew up in a palace full of whispers. He would have known what his own body could and couldn't do. He would have heard the soft footsteps behind the curtain, felt the urgency in his wife's voice, seen the unease in his advisor's eyes when another attempt at an heir failed. The gods may have been back in the temples, but their so-called living avatar was dying in private. And still, every morning he put on the crown, he performed rituals, he stood, perhaps trembling before the people, he held festivals, issued decrees, sat for portraits. He fulfilled the role expected of him, even as his body resisted every step. Because in ancient Egypt, optics were everything. As long as the pharaoh appeared strong, the nation could believe the gods were satisfied, and so Tut played his part, not with power, but with performance. And perhaps that's the most human thing about him. So the next time you see that glittering gold death mask, flawless, smooth, radiant, remember what was underneath: bone disease, scoliosis, pain, and exhaustion. A boy too broken to walk straight, but too proud to sit out the role of a lifetime. Next, we'll step out of the palace and into the court. The web of advisors, schemers, and backroom puppet masters who pulled the strings while Tut tried to stay upright. The palace was filled with polished stone and polished smiles, but in the shadows someone was always waiting to take the crown. Tutankhamun may have worn the double crown of Egypt, but make no mistake, he wasn't the one holding the reins. Not really. At least, not alone. Behind the polished limestone columns and perfumed corridors of the royal court, another kind of power simmered. Quieter, older, far more practiced. Egypt wasn't just ruled by kings. It was held together by advisors, scribes, generals, priests, and seasoned manipulators who'd spent decades perfecting the art of looking loyal while plotting their next move. And among them, two names stood taller than the rest: I and Horemheb. Let's start with I. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud, but I had been in the palace long before Tut was even born. Some historians think he may have been Nefertiti's father, or at the very least a close relative. He'd served under Akhenaten during the heretics' wild religious roller coaster, kept his head down, and somehow managed to survive every political purge that followed. He was the royal vizier, the grandmaster of the bureaucratic chessboard, and he knew how to move pieces silently. Tutankhamun was his golden pawn. It was I who helped orchestrate the boy's coronation. It was I who likely wrote the speeches, approved the royal decrees, and whispered advice in the young king's ear. He didn't need a throne. He had proximity, influence, access. And when your king is 9 years old and barely strong enough to walk unaided, proximity is everything. But A wasn't the only power player in the palace. Enter Horemheb, general, enforcer, and future king-in-waiting. If A was the shadow behind the throne, Horemheb was the iron hammer behind the army. He'd risen through the ranks during Akhenaten's chaotic reign, somehow navigating the religious flip-flop without losing the loyalty of his troops. That alone was a miracle. He commanded respect, inspired fear, and, most importantly, controlled Egypt's military muscle. Where A played the long game of politics, Horemheb played the short game of intimidation. Together they made a dangerous duet, the soft voice of tradition and the hard fist of the army. And between them stood Tut, fragile, idealistic, and surrounded by dangerous uncles. Now, was Tut aware of all this? Possibly. He may have suspected it, but his options were limited. At best, he could attempt to balance the two, grant I his ceremonies, and Horemheb his campaigns. At worst, he was little more than ceremonial gold leaf plastered over a machine that ran without him. It didn't help that the court was full of ghosts. The ghost of Akhenaten, whose religious revolution had alienated the priesthood and enraged traditionalists. The ghost of Nefertiti, who may have briefly ruled before vanishing from history. The ghost of Smenkhare, the elusive ruler, possibly Tut's brother, possibly Nefertiti in disguise, who sat on the throne for just long enough to confuse everyone. The walls whispered with secrets, and the whispers had teeth. At court, every conversation was rehearsed, every compliment was calculated. Courtiers watched one another like cobras in a basket, waiting for someone to blink the wrong way. A careless word could mean exile. A poorly timed alliance could mean death. Tut's youth and inexperience made him vulnerable to flattery, susceptible to suggestion. But it also made him a symbol, something the people could believe in, even as the power behind the scenes jostled and scraped. And then there was Ankhesenamun, Tut's half-sister and queen. While her marriage was arranged, her presence in the court was not decorative. She'd grown up amid the chaos of her father Akhenaten's rule, seen the collapse of the Amarna experiment firsthand, and knew how quickly favour could shift. Some scholars believe she tried to assert her own agency during Tut's reign, advocating for religious restoration, and perhaps even resisting the ambitions of Ai and Horemheb. But even queens were not untouchable. The death of Tut and Ankhesenamun's daughters left them politically exposed. A pharaoh without an heir is a pharaoh with an expiration date. and everyone in that court could read a ticking clock when they saw one. A began positioning himself more visibly. Inscriptions show his name growing larger, his titles multiplying. Horemheb, meanwhile, began commissioning monuments and military campaigns that emphasized his own divine favour. They weren't just advisors anymore, they were contenders. And in the midst of this royal slow-motion coup, Tut died. Whether it was from a broken leg, malaria, infection, or something darker, his sudden death shattered the precarious balance of power. The throne was empty, the gods were watching, and a civil war in silks and scrolls began. I acted fast. Too fast. He had himself declared pharaoh, an old man claiming the throne through marriage to Ankhesenamun. Some believe it was a forced union. Others suggest it was political blackmail. But what's clear is that the queen vanished from history soon after. No tomb, no funeral, no inscription. Just silence. Horemheb didn't protest. Not publicly. But he waited. Bided his time. When A died a few years later, Horemheb took the throne. Not by birthright, but by sheer force of will. He declared himself the restorer of order, the cleanser of heresy, and the official pharaoh of let's pretend the last 20 years didn't happen. He erased Tut, scrubbed his name from official lists, chiselled his inscriptions into oblivion, wiped the dynasty clean. It was history rewritten by the victors, and Tutankhamun was collateral damage. All that effort to build a legacy, and it was gone in a decade. But history, like tomb curses, has a funny way of catching up. Thousands of years later, Tut's name would re-emerge, not through temples or scrolls, but through a dusty tomb door in the Valley of the Kings, a discovery that would make him the most famous pharaoh in history. His face would adorn museums, documentaries, and Halloween costumes. Horemheb, I, forgotten by most, footnotes in the saga of the boy king. Because power, no matter how carefully plotted, fades. But gold, it seems, lasts forever. Next time we step into the tomb itself, not in 1922, but at the moment of burial. The incense, the rituals, the panic decisions, the hurried craftsmanship. Because if Tut's funeral was meant to honour a god, why did it feel like such a rush job? So here's the part of the story where everything starts to smell a little off. And no, not just from mummification resin. By now we've followed young Tutankhamun through his sickly rise to the throne, his pain-ridden rule, and his precarious place in a court of power-hungry puppet masters. His sudden death left a vacuum, his enemies circled. But when the time came to bury the divine child of Amun, you'd expect the most opulent, perfect, mind-blowingly monumental burial Egypt had ever seen. Instead, what Tut got was, let's be honest here, a royal afterthought. Let's rewind a bit. Pharaohs didn't just die in ancient Egypt. Their journey into the afterlife was supposed to be the ultimate event, a seamless transition from mortal king to eternal god. And that meant months or even years of preparation. Grand tombs, gold-encrusted sarcophagi, spells etched into walls, sacred oils brewed in holy basins, the works. But Tutankhamun's tomb, tiny, crooked, rushed, haphazard. Seriously, it's barely big enough to swing a shabti in. The burial chamber is smaller than the average nobleman's house. The walls were sloppily plastered and hastily painted. So hastily, in fact, that some of the paint hadn't even dried when the door was sealed. There are visible fingerprints and smudges still preserved on the surface. One wall scene was clearly meant to depict A performing the opening of the mouth ritual on the deceased Tut. But the style was clumsy, the colours uneven, and the text oddly phrased, almost like the artisan was cribbing from an old funeral manual. This wasn't reverence, this was panic. Let's talk tomb location. Tut's final resting place, KV-62, sits awkwardly jammed into a side corridor of the Valley of the Kings. It's nestled beneath the grander tomb of Ramses VI, almost like someone said, "Just tuck him here, no one will notice." Egyptologists now believe the tomb wasn't even meant for him. It was likely built for someone of lesser royal status, maybe even a queen. But when the boy king died suddenly, with no grand tomb of his own ready, they needed a plan B. Fast. Why? Because A needed him buried. Quickly. Not just to preserve the body, but to legitimize himself. Performing the funerary rites for the deceased king was a powerful political move. It was how you signalled to the gods and the people that the crown had passed to you with divine approval. So Tut's body was prepared in a whirlwind, but even that went sideways. When his mummy was finally unwrapped in the early 20th century, it was a mess, charred black, stuck to the bottom of the coffin. At first, some speculated that the embalmers had used an unusually large amount of resin, but more recent research suggests something even stranger, a chemical reaction. The oils and resins used to preserve his body may have been applied too heavily and sealed in too quickly, triggering a spontaneous combustion. That's right. King Tut may have literally been cooked in his own sarcophagus. That's not sacred. That's macabre slapstick. And there's more. His burial items, while beautiful, were repurposed. His golden coffin was too small. His burial mask, flawless, but closer inspection reveals that the name originally inscribed wasn't Tutankhamun. It was likely Neferneferuaten, possibly Nefertiti's name, erased and rewritten to suit a sudden change in plans. It's as if the tomb was stocked from the palace's clearance aisle, but none of this means Tut wasn't important. Quite the opposite. He was too important to too many people for his death to be handled with transparency. There are reasons why this funeral was more like a cover-up than a coronation. Let's break those down. First, there's the timing. He died young, with no warning, no heir, and no plan. That alone creates chaos. Second, A wanted the throne, and marrying the widowed queen and handling the funeral rites fast-tracked his claim. The longer Tut's body sat unburied, the more vulnerable A's ambitions became. Third, and this one's still up for debate, there are whispers of murder. A CT scan of Tut's skull revealed a fracture at the base of his head. Initially that set off alarm bells. Was he bludgeoned? Poisoned? Did someone, perhaps eager to fast-forward the succession, help him along to the afterlife? Most Egyptologists today believe the fracture occurred after death, possibly during the rough handling of his body or mummification, but the mystery remains. His sudden passing, the rushed burial, the political reshuffling, it all smells like a carefully swept carpet over a very messy floor. Even the positioning of his tomb tells a tale. Despite being filled with breathtaking treasures, thrones, jewellery, chariots, weapons, games, the layout is clunky. Objects were crammed in without planning. Furniture was stacked, not staged. It's like someone ran through a royal warehouse grabbing items with a checklist. One ankh, one crook and flail, a boat. Sure, grab the second best sandals, we're out of time. You can almost hear a royal steward yelling, "He's dead! We're already 2 weeks behind, just stuff it and seal it." And then there's the door. When Howard Carter found it in 1922, sealed shut and still intact, the world gasped. But even Carter noticed something odd. The seals had been broken and resealed. Grave robbers had been there. Twice, shortly after the burial. They stole small items, oils, perfumes, easily carried valuables. But then someone had resealed the tomb before any serious plundering could happen. It was a tomb too chaotic for looters and too sacred for complete erasure, and ironically that chaos is what saved it. The bigger tombs, the grand ones with straight corridors and giant vaults, they were emptied centuries ago. But Tut's cramped little tomb, awkwardly placed and hastily packed, survived. Forgotten by the pharaohs who followed, ignored by grave robbers, hidden beneath the literal shadow of Ramses. Sometimes being an afterthought is the best form of security, and that's what makes this part of Tut's story so strangely beautiful. For all its mess, all its political scheming and burial bloopers, his tomb became the most iconic archaeological discovery in history. Every chipped figurine, every bent arrow, every lovingly folded kilt told a story, not just of a boy king, but of a world trying desperately to pretend it had everything under control. It didn't. It buried a teenager in a second-hand tomb with reheated resin under someone else's name, and then it moved on. But history didn't. Next, we turn from tombs to treasures, because while the burial may have been rushed, what went inside that dusty chamber has captivated the world for over a century. Let's crack open the gold and see what those objects tell us about the living boy behind the mask. When Howard Carter cracked open the door to Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 and peered inside by candlelight, he didn't say, "Wow," or "incredible," or even, "There it is." Number simply said, "Yes, wonderful things." And that might be the understatement of the century. Tutankhamun's tomb contained over 5,000 individual artifacts, packed into 4 small rooms with the organisational strategy of a frantic royal garage sale. Chairs stacked on beds, shields leaning against musical instruments, sandals crammed next to sacred statues. It looked less like a divine burial chamber and more like someone had 5 hours to clean out a teenage pharaoh's bedroom before his parents got home. But beneath the clutter was a dazzling time capsule, a portrait of royalty not just in death, but in life. Let's begin with the iconic burial mask, the golden glass face of the boy king. Weighing over 22 pounds of solid gold, it's inlaid with lapis lazuli, obsidian, turquoise, and faience. The mask shows Tut with perfect symmetry, serene eyes, youthful features, false beard, Nemes headdress. But what most people miss is this: the ears are pierced. In life, Tut wore earrings. His funerary mask quietly reminds us that he wasn't some distant divine abstraction. He was a kid. Next, let's talk wardrobe. Tutankhamun may have had trouble walking, but he did not skimp on style. His tomb included over 100 garments, from linen tunics to finely pleated kilts. There were elaborate collars, embroidered sashes, even a linen diaper embroidered with gold thread. Because nothing says divine royalty like flossy undergarments. His sandals are especially revealing. Some were made of gold, others were simple reed or leather. A few were designed with enemies carved into the soles, so every time he walked, he symbolically crushed his foes underfoot. Imagine Nike releasing a revenge line where every step literally disrespects your haters. Ancient Egypt did it first. And then there's jewellery. So much jewellery. Rings, pendants, scarabs and pectorals made from gold, electrum and semi-precious stones. One piece, now known as the solar scarab, contains a yellow-green stone formed from desert glass, likely created by a meteorite impact in the Sahara. That's right, King Tut wore space jewellery. But perhaps the most personal items are the ones that speak not to power, but to personality. His tomb included games, like Senet, a board game of luck and strategy. Multiple game boards were found, some worn from use. He didn't just rule, he played. The kind of details you don't expect from a pharaoh, but that humanise him entirely. There were cosmetic boxes filled with perfumed oils and ointments, combs, mirrors, containers of kohl for his eyes. Tutankhamun may have been fragile, but he was fabulous. The tomb even included a lock of his grandmother's hair, a tiny emotional relic tucked into a wooden box, reminding us that even kings miss their nanas sometimes. Now for the military gear, and here's where things get complicated. Tut's tomb included chariots, bows, arrows, shields, and daggers. Some of it ceremonial, some possibly functional. One dagger in particular stood out. Crafted from iron from a meteorite, this blade predates widespread ironworking in Egypt. Tut literally carried a knife from the heavens. and yet all signs point to a king who never used them in battle. No battlefield scars, no military records. The gear was likely symbolic, royal cosplay, reinforcing the ideal of the warrior pharaoh, even if the real Tutankhamun spent more time playing senet than swinging a blade. But the treasures weren't just about luxury, they tell us about belief. The tomb was packed with objects meant to help Tut in the afterlife. Statues of gods, magic bricks, shabtis, miniature servant figurines, and ritual boats. These weren't trinkets, they were insurance policies. Each item had a purpose, to guide, protect, or serve the pharaoh as he journeyed through the underworld. Because in Egyptian belief, the afterlife wasn't heaven with palm trees, it was an obstacle course. You had to prove your worth, evade monsters, answer riddles, and pass judgment. So Tut was buried with everything he'd need. If he had to sail across the lake of fire, here's a model boat. If he faced demons, here's a staff and spells. If he got bored, here's a board game. Honestly, it's more thorough than most college packing lists. Still, even in death, things didn't go as planned. The sheer amount of stuff jammed into that small tomb meant many objects were damaged or crammed haphazardly. Furniture was snapped to fit through doors, chariots disassembled and stacked. Coffins were too large for the burial chamber and had to be wedged in sideways. And that wasn't the only improvisation. Tut's famous nested coffins, 3 in total, include one that wasn't made for him. The innermost is solid gold and beautifully crafted, yes, but signs suggest it was originally made for a different royal woman. Her name was scraped off. Tut's inserted. Another artifact, another emergency substitution. Even the outer shrine that encased the sarcophagus had to be partially disassembled just to get into the tomb. The builders hadn't planned for this space. It's like buying an IKEA bed and discovering it doesn't fit through the stairwell, except the bed is a 1,000-year-old golden sarcophagus, and the stairwell is sacred rock. And yet, for all the awkward angles and jigsaw arrangements, the tomb glowed. There was a kind of haunted majesty in its clutter, a sense that here, in this cramped cave of gold and dust, was a boy who'd been loved, honoured, sent into eternity with everything his handlers could find on short notice. Tut may not have had the most glorious rule. His name may have been erased from official records, but this mess of treasure, this glorious pile of legacy and scramble, kept him alive in memory. The tomb wasn't perfect, but it was unforgettable, and when it was finally sealed, it sat undisturbed for over 3,000 years. While empires rose and fell, while languages were born and lost, while gods came and went, Tutankhamun lay still, surrounded by games, oils, sandals, knives, perfumes, daggers from the stars and his grandmother's hair. A boy king in a golden time capsule, waiting for the world to remember him. Next time we'll zoom in even closer, not on his treasures, but on his face, or rather, the reconstructions of it. Because when modern scientists tried to show us what Tutankhamun really looked like, the results were startling to say the least. Ask ChatGPT. So far we've walked with Tutankhamun through the palace halls, the political minefields, the frantic tomb preparations, and the glittering treasure piles of a very scrambled afterlife. But here's the part where things get personal. Because for all the golden masks and divine titles, there's one burning question that has haunted researchers for decades. What did King Tut actually look like? Forget the mask, forget the statues. We're talking his face, his body, his living, breathing teenage self. What did the most famous boy king in history look like when he wasn't frozen in gold? The answer, after decades of scans, autopsies, and some truly unsettling computer models, is probably not great. Let's start at the beginning. When British archaeologist Howard Carter and his team first discovered the mummy of Tutankhamun in 1925, they were not gentle. The body had been badly charred, possibly due to that botched embalming we talked about, and was stuck to the base of the coffin like old gum under a movie theatre seat. In the process of prying him loose, they broke several bones, removed the skull cap, disassembled his limbs, and basically reduced Egypt's most iconic mummy to a royal jigsaw puzzle. Still, they catalogued what they could. A slender youth, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighing approximately 90 pounds at death. But his features were hard to make out. His nose was flattened, his pelvis was damaged, and some of his bones were simply missing, stolen or lost in the chaotic unwrapping process. For years, speculation ran wild. Was he handsome, athletic, regal, deformed? We didn't get clearer answers until the early 2000s, when CT scanning technology allowed researchers to digitally reassemble and analyse Tutankhamun's remains in 3D. And what they found was complicated. Let's just say the results were not flattering. King Tut had a clubbed left foot, likely caused by a condition called Kohler's disease, a rare disorder that affects bone development in the foot. His right foot, though normal, showed signs of overuse, suggesting he limped. He had scoliosis, meaning his spine was curved, and a slightly elongated skull, a common trait among royalty at the time, though possibly made worse by inbreeding. His chest wall was collapsed. Some argue it happened during mummification, others think it was post-mortem damage. Either way, the chest cavity was missing entirely. That's right. The boy king's torso was gone. No heart, no sternum, no rib cage. Now in Egyptian burial tradition, the heart was critical. It was weighed in the afterlife against the feather of Mayat to determine one's purity and worth. No heart meant no judgment. No judgment meant no peace. So why was Tut's heart missing? Theories abound. Was it destroyed in the botched embalming? Removed due to injury or disease? Hidden for political reasons? We may never know. But the absence was unusual enough that it made scholars whisper, and superstitious types shudder. And then there was the DNA analysis. In 2010, a team led by Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities conducted a genetic study on Tutankhamun and several other royal mummies. What they uncovered was a family tree that looked more like a tangled fishing net. Tut's parents were likely siblings. His father was Akhenaten, that much was expected, but his mother was not Nefertiti as many assumed. Instead, she was a younger lady. An anonymous woman confirmed via DNA to be Akhenaten's full sister. That's right, full sibling marriage, not just kissing cousins, not even technically half siblings, full sibling union. Tutankhamun was, genetically speaking, a mess. His lineage had looped in on itself so many times that researchers estimate he had a higher chance of inheriting recessive genetic disorders than the average medieval European noble, which is saying something. And sure enough, the evidence was in his bones. The CT scans revealed signs of cleft palate, mild cranial abnormalities, and several bone diseases, including femoral necrosis, where the thigh bones start to die due to poor blood supply. This wasn't a king who led armies. This was a kid who probably needed a cane to walk, and his tomb contained multiple canes worn at the handle. One study even suggested he had malaria, possibly multiple infections. Combine that with his physical limitations and you've got a ticking time bomb wrapped in linen and divine titles. And then came the reconstructions. In 2005, a team of forensic artists from Egypt, France and the US worked with CT data to create a facial model of Tutankhamun. The results made headlines around the world, and not necessarily the flattering kind. Gone was the Hollywood idea of a bronzed, broad-shouldered pharaoh with a steely stare. In its place stood a soft-featured, slightly awkward teenager with an overbite, gentle jawline and eyes that seemed to ask, "Do I really have to rule all of this?" Later reconstructions varied in detail but remained consistent in tone. Tut looked like a frail, possibly sickly boy, not a warrior, not a god, a human. One forged from fragile genetics, over ambitious theology and dynastic tunnel vision. And that's what makes this all so fascinating, because the gold, the chariots, the daggers from the stars, they're one side of the myth, the mask. But peel back the gold leaf, and what you find is the other truth. A boy born into expectations his body may never have been able to fulfill. A king not chosen by strength, but by inheritance, obligation, and divine propaganda. We don't remember Tutankhamun because he conquered enemies or built pyramids. We remember him because his tomb, chaotic, rushed, and jammed with wonders, survived. Because fate, for once, ignored the powerful and preserved the vulnerable. And because when you stare into the reconstructed face of Tutankhamun, it doesn't feel like you're looking at a distant deity. It feels like you're looking at a teenager, overwhelmed, under pressure, carrying too much weight for too little time. And maybe that's why the world can't look away. Next, we follow the journey not of the king, but of the tomb itself. How it lay hidden, how it avoided plunder, and how a handful of British men with pickaxes, pencils, and cameras stumbled into the biggest archaeological find of all time, and sparked a global Tut mania that hasn't stopped since. By this point in the story, King Tutankhamun had been dead for over 3,000 years. His tomb was sealed, his name mostly erased from official records, and his story swallowed by the shifting sands of time. His dynasty was forgotten. His body, blackened and broken, lay hidden beneath the rubble of other kings in a cramped tomb built in a hurry. His glory days, such as they were, seemed destined to stay buried forever. Until a man named Howard Carter showed up with a shovel, a hunch, and the financial backing of a very impatient British earl. Let's rewind to the early 1900s. The Valley of the Kings in Egypt was already well known to archaeologists. Dozens of royal tombs had been uncovered since the 1800s, most of them long since looted. In fact, the general consensus at the time was that there was nothing left to find. The big stuff was already gone. Pharaoh hunting season was over. But Carter didn't buy it. He was convinced, obsessed really, that one tomb had been missed. A young little-known pharaoh from the late 18th dynasty, a forgotten boy king whose name had appeared only on a handful of artifacts. Most scholars dismissed the idea. Carter doubled down. He scoured old excavation maps, cross-referenced royal inventories, and returned again and again to a patch of ground in the valley that had once been used as a workman's hut site. It was to most people the least promising spot in the entire necropolis. But on November 4th, 1922, a water boy tripped over a step. That single step led to a staircase. The staircase led to a sealed doorway. And the seal? It bore the faint impression of a royal cartouche, one that read, unmistakably, Tutankhamun. Carter was stunned. After years of digging, dead ends, and dwindling funding, he had found something. He summoned his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who raced to Egypt and arrived just in time for the moment that would make archaeological history. On November 26th, Carter chipped away at the sealed door, inserted a candle and peered inside. Lord Carnarvon, hovering behind him, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter's now legendary reply, "Yes, wonderful things." And he wasn't kidding. The antechamber was a dazzling mess. Golden beds shaped like animals, disassembled chariots, ceremonial shields, alabaster vases, baskets of fruit, walking sticks, weapons, fans, statues. Every surface glittered. Every object was crammed into every available inch. It was chaos, but it was royal chaos. The kind that screamed untouched. The tomb had been robbed, briefly, twice in antiquity, but most of the contents were still there. It was a miracle. A perfectly preserved burial chamber of a pharaoh, untouched by modern hands. For Carter and Carnarvon, it was the find of a lifetime. But for the world, it was about to become something much bigger. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Within weeks, Tutankhamun mania had gripped Europe and the United States. Newspapers ran breathless stories about the tomb, the treasures, the mysterious boy king no one had ever heard of. Photos of the gleaming mask, the nested coffins, and the golden shrines made their way into drawing rooms, magazines, and school books. King Tut in death had become a global celebrity. But fame comes with baggage, especially when you're 3,000 years late to the spotlight. Let's talk about the curse, because no Tutankhamun story is complete without it. Just months after the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon, the wealthy patron who had funded the excavation, died suddenly. An infected mosquito bite became blood poisoning. He passed away in a Cairo hotel. The lights reportedly flickered across the city. His dog, back in England, allegedly howled and dropped dead at the exact same time. Spooky? Absolutely. Scientific? Debatable. The press went wild. Headlines screamed, "The mummy's curse strikes again." Every mishap, death, or stubbed toe connected to the expedition was rolled into the legend. Reporters claimed Carter's canary had been eaten by a cobra. They linked any death within 6 degrees of the tomb to supernatural retribution. In reality, most of the excavation team lived for decades. Carter himself died in 1939, 17 years after the discovery, from lymphoma. But the myth stuck. Why? Because humans love a good ghost story, and the idea that ancient gods might strike down greedy foreigners made for a very satisfying narrative, especially when colonialism and mysticism were already tangled up in the public imagination. Meanwhile, back in the real world, Carter spent 10 years cataloguing the tomb's contents. It was slow, meticulous work. Every object had to be photographed, sketched, measured, and stabilized before being removed. Some were wrapped in delicate linens, others were disassembled like sacred IKEA furniture. The sheer variety was staggering, a snapshot of 18th dynasty luxury, from ivory combs to golden thrones. One of the biggest surprises came when Carter reached the burial chamber. Inside, 4 golden shrines nested like Russian dolls, then the sarcophagus, then 3 coffins, and finally the mummy itself, charred, battered, and stuck like glue to the bottom of the gold coffin. It was a grim final twist in a story already loaded with mystery. Carter, ever the professional, handled it all with a stiff upper lip and a chisel. He didn't talk much about the body afterward, and for decades Tutankhamun's physical remains were left out of public view, overshadowed by the treasures that surrounded him. But his name exploded. By the 1930s, King Tut had appeared in fashion, cartoons, jazz songs, radio skits, children's books, and advertising campaigns. Art Deco designers borrowed Egyptian motifs. Children wore Tut masks for Halloween. In 1976, the Travelling Treasures of Tutankhamun exhibit opened in the US and drew over 8 million visitors. Americans waited hours to see the golden mask. People wept. Couples proposed in front of it. It was a sensation. Tut, who barely ruled for a decade and left no heirs, had become the most famous pharaoh in history. Not because of what he did, but because of what he left behind. Or rather, what wasn't taken. That's the irony. More powerful kings had larger tombs, bigger empires, longer legacies, but their graves were empty, looted, forgotten. Tut's tiny, poorly planned, cobbled-together chamber, crammed under the dust of other tombs, survived by accident. And in doing so, it made him immortal. The world didn't remember Tutankhamun because of glory. It remembered him because of luck, chaos, and one persistent archaeologist with a candle and a hunch. Next, we close the circle, not on Tut's story, but on how it still echoes. Because in our final chapter, we'll explore Tut's afterlife in modern culture, how a young boy's burial became a billion-dollar industry, a museum centerpiece, a music icon, and maybe, just maybe, a mirror of our own obsession with youth, beauty and glittering decay. By now you've seen the boy behind the gold, the fragile teenager hidden beneath the divine mask, the king who limped through life but somehow marched through eternity. You've walked through his palace, stood in his tomb, stared into the awkward reconstructions of his real face. You've met his gods, his doctors, his embalmers, his would-be murder suspects. You've seen how a forgotten pharaoh became the most famous mummy in the world. But our journey with Tutankhamun doesn't end in the tomb, because in some ways that's where his real afterlife began. See, when Carter opened the tomb in 1922, he didn't just unearth ancient artifacts, he unleashed a cultural tidal wave, one that would carry Tutankhamun through the 20th century and straight into the modern world. And what followed was something ancient Egypt could never have imagined. Tut became a brand. Let's rewind to the 1920s. Post-World War I society was gripped by both trauma and wonder. The old world had shattered. People were looking for meaning, for mystery, for escape. So when Carter pulled open that dusty doorway and revealed a chamber overflowing with gold, the world latched onto it like a lifeline. Tutankhamun didn't just fill museum halls, he filled newspapers, novels, cocktail bars, jazz clubs, and jewellery counters. Egyptian motifs swept through Art Deco design like a sandstorm. Papyrus fonts and pyramid silhouettes appeared on everything from perfume bottles to kitchen tiles. Women wore headdresses styled like Nefertiti. Men bought cufflinks shaped like scarabs. Everyone wanted a piece of the Nile. Tut had become fashion. And then came Hollywood. By the 1930s, mummy-themed horror films were stomping their way onto silver screens. Lonely, bandaged pharaohs lumbering through moonlit tombs in search of lost love. They bore little resemblance to the real Tutankhamun, but it didn't matter. He had inspired a new genre. The silent king had become the star of his own cinematic universe. Fast forward to 1978. The Travelling Treasures of Tutankhamun exhibit hits the United States like a cultural earthquake. People lined up for 8 hours just to see his golden mask. Schools sent field trips. Couples got engaged under his gaze. T-shirts, lunchboxes, novelty mugs. Tut-mania reached a fever pitch. And then, of course, there was Steve Martin. Yes, that's Steve Martin. In 1978, the comedian performed a musical tribute called King Tut on Saturday Night Live, a parody of the hype surrounding the exhibit. Dressed in gold lame and flanked by saxophones, he belted out lyrics like, "Born in Arizona, moved to Babylonia," while dancers dressed as mummies grooved behind him. It was ridiculous, it was catchy, and it reached number 1, 17 on the Billboard charts. That's right, King Tut had become a pop song, and the best part, the proceeds from the record helped support museum preservation of the actual artifacts, so even parody became preservation. Since then, Tut has shown no signs of fading. He's been featured in video games, comic books, Halloween costumes, and internet memes. He's been re-examined in documentaries, podcasts, and virtual reality exhibits. His DNA has been sequenced, his sandals digitized, his face re-rendered in 3D. He's been to more countries dead than most people go to alive. And through it all, he still doesn't have a heart. Somehow that feels fitting. A king whose own people tried to erase him from history, only to have him become its most enduring symbol. A pharaoh who never built a pyramid, never won a war, never rewrote the laws of the land. Just a boy with a cane and a cursed family tree who was buried in a rush and left behind a closet full of treasure. The mask says eternity. The body says otherwise. And maybe that's why we're still telling his story. Because buried inside the gold, the curses, the global exhibitions, and the bedtime history videos is something beautifully human. A reminder that even the most glittering legacies often begin with fragile beginnings, unfinished plans, and a little bit of luck. So the next time you see Tutankhamun's face, whether on a museum banner, a coffee mug, or some animated thumbnail on YouTube, remember this. He wasn't meant to be remembered, but he was. And maybe, just maybe, there's something kind of comforting about that. Now, if you've made it this far, I want to say thank you. These stories take time to build, and I hope they've brought you a little curiosity, a little calm, and a whole lot of wonder. If you're still awake, consider gently tapping that like button and subscribing so you don't miss our next sleepy dive into history. And if you're already drifting off, no worries. Let the winds of the Nile carry you into your dreams, and may your afterlife come with gold sandals and fewer political assassinations. Good night, traveller. See you in the next dynasty.